As a systems practitioner, over time I became more fully acquainted with Stafford Beer's viable system model. It's often known as the VSM. The VSM can be described as a way of looking at how we manage complexity in organisations, or indeed in any situation we perceive to be a system. I learnt from Stafford Beer's work that organisations or systems don't survive in a vacuum. They exist in a changing environment. Therefore, an organisation or system must be adaptive to the changing environment in order to survive. It sounds obvious, doesn't it? But unfortunately, the models we usually use to understand organisations generally only go as far as helping us to understand things like the hierarchy or how a process works. There's little that helps us understand how the organisation manages complexity, and this is what the VSM offers, a way of understanding how the organisation manages complexity and adapts to the changing environment. And initially I found the academic texts about the VSM almost impenetrable, and as such it was not an easy introduction for me. There it was in the corner of my change management party, staring at me like a drooling, growling monster. But being me, I couldn't resist poking it with a stick just to see how it would react. And it confused me at first because I was never quite sure if it was about organisation or an organisation. And that was mainly because the text I was learning from used both words so very closely together that I sometimes mixed the two up. And I wasn't the only one either. Several colleagues made the same mistake at the same time too. But it was not long before I realised it was about organisation, whether that was an organisation or any other kind of conceptual system. And then me and the VSM soon started to get along quite nicely. I was beginning to understand that two things were key for effective public services, which was where I was working at the time: managing complexity at the right place and adaptability. And for this reason, the VSM became an ideal candidate for use in the work that I was doing. It enabled me to view the world of public services very differently to when I had first started working in that arena. It supported me to look more deeply, to see what made the organisations and the wider system breathe, what made their heart beat, what conditions had to exist to enable them to survive, what made them sick, and what made them enter into the throes of death. I started to probe much deeper and consider how different services and teams interacted with each other and with their environment. I also looked at how individuals in the situation behaved. I looked at what interdependencies existed or did not exist but should or could exist. I examined the drivers of internal and external complexity and whether that complexity was being absorbed, matched, battered away or simply ignored. I studied the energy levels in situations. Were people and processes energised or frantic? I wanted to get a sense of whether people were stressed, fearful, or even in despair. Whether calm and laid back without a care in the world. I started to consider more than what is this thing, but also what does it do? How does it behave? So I grew to see the value of the VSM. It helped me to see if there were any variety imbalances driving disorder in the systems I was engaging with. I started to consider interactions between the operations and the external environment to see if there was a relevant and appropriate value exchange happening. I looked for imbalances between the autonomy teams required to innovate and the cohesion the organisation needed to maintain its chosen identity. It encouraged me to explore whether the rate of change was causing problems. I started to see where the rate of change was too fast and people were doing things that nobody wanted yet, and where it was too slow and teams were continuing to do things that nobody wanted anymore. I became able to dive much deeper into the complexity of situations, and I started to recognise when resource conflicts arose as a result of weak resource bargaining. I observed turf wars between different teams, which was indicative of issues in coordination. I identified common elements of purpose across different teams and organisations, and I contemplated what that meant for those working together, and if it meant anything at all. I became mindful of system pathologies, which are patterns of system behaviour that can cause issues in situations. I noticed when they played a part in reducing the effectiveness of teams and organisations. And I also saw a human element embedded deeply within the model and the concepts I was using. This human element was hidden in the technical texts and talks about structure and dynamics. Over time, I realised that the principles on which the VSM work could be applied to almost anything. And it struck me that I could use the VSM in a way that changed the context of the model from management to also include leadership and, as well, system leadership. And this influenced the development of my own systems thinking approach, which I called Creating the Conditions for Change. This is a creative interpretation of the VSM focused on the human elements of the situation. All in all, the VSM enabled me to appreciate how observing deeply and really understanding how things worked helped me to figure out what improvements to suggest. The work I was doing was not always about putting things right per se, but I still felt it necessary to understand the situations I was engaging with to the fullest of my ability. The lenses I started to look at the situation with shone a bright lens into the dark corners. At the same time, the illuminated areas where people were demonstrating really sparkling brilliance and it was being overlooked. So by bringing the VSM and other systems thinking approaches into the work, I gained much greater, more relevant and more useful insights every day. The huge bonus was that I was no longer scared of complex situations. I wasn't frozen, not knowing where to start. I was building my own way of embodying systems thinking, drawing on multiple established models, methods and concepts. I liked how it was supporting me to do the job. I also liked that I carried the thinking into my private life. I have to say that it changed the whole way I was engaging with and understanding things around me. I gained a strong sense of what my life meant to me and what it could be as I move forward as a result.